everyone, welcome to another Keats-Shelley Association of America video interview. These interviews are organised and conducted by our communications fellows. So remember that links to other videos by us and our K-SAA blog can all be found in the link under this video, in the information under this video, along with our email address. So we'd love to hear from you, our subscribers and members and friends. So please get in touch with questions, comments and ideas if you have them. You can also go to k-saa.org to find out more about the association itself. So today, Communications Fellow Mariam Wasif will be interviewing dress historian Hilary Davidson. Hilary will be introduced fully by Mariam very shortly. Mariam received her PhD from Cornell University in 2018 with a specialization in British and French literature of the long 18th century, including Romanticism, and she is currently a postdoc at the University of Paris. So I'm going to hand over to Mariam now to conduct the interview.
So Hilary Davidson is a dress historian and curator based between Sydney and London. She was curator of fashion and decorative arts at the Museum of London between 2007 and 2012, and has lectured and taught for many years. She's also published and broadcast extensively on dress history, including presenting on the BBC documentary Pride and Prejudice, Having a Ball in 2013. Hilary is completing a PhD at La Trobe University in Melbourne and is an honorary associate at the University of Sydney. Her reconstruction of Jane Austen's police coat, published in the journal Costume in 2015, led to an extensive study of British Regency dress, published as Dress in the Age of Jane Austen by Yale University Press in 2019. And that's the book that will be the subject of our conversation today. And I ordered a copy from my library and have been devouring it. It's an extraordinary book and a wonderful resource with supplementary materials, including a timeline of changes in women's gowns and a glossary of Regency dress. So Hilary, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you for inviting me, Mariam.
It's a pleasure. I'll start by asking you to define a couple of keywords. So dress historians, including yourself, distinguish between the terms dress and fashion. Could you explain the difference between the two?
With pleasure. Sometimes I call myself a fashion historian because it's easier for people to understand that that's to do with clothing. But I prefer dress because it's more accurate. It's the bigger term. Dress is everything and anything that humans do to adorn their bodies. So that encompasses bikinis and spacesuits and tattoos and piercings and hairstyles and shoes and absolutely everything that we do on our bodies. Whereas fashion's kind of a smaller subset of that, which is about regular change and new invention and keeping up with a certain change of mode. So fashion is a part of the much bigger picture of dress.
That's such a helpful distinction. Thank you. So your book uses both terms. It's entitled Dress in the Age of Jane Austen, Regency Fashion. And can you tell us why you use Jane Austen as a historical reference point and source? What were some of the major changes in dress in her lifetime between 1775 and 1817? And what did those changes reflect about society more broadly?
Well, Jane Austen, first of all, her lifetime encompasses a really, really interesting period of change in clothing, but also in the wider world. But I really wanted to center the book around Austen because I feel that's so often the way that people come to the Regency period is either through reading Austen directly, through adaptations of her work, or through kind of imitations inspired by like historical romances like Georgette Heyer. So in the English-speaking world, and beyond even, Jane Austen is inextricably linked with Regency clothing, and our perceptions of what Regency dress is so shaped by adaptations of Jane Austen. I'd been doing this work on her pelisse, so this is kind of the book that I wanted to read that nobody had written. And because I'd been looking into Jane Austen's life itself, I realized what a great point she was. As I say in the introduction, she's the middle gentry of the middle classes in Britain. She's this amazing center point, both for what her work has ended up representing about the Regency, but also for who she was and who her family was. She's this fantastically representative figure. So that was kind of my starting point, was sort of, all right, if Austen is where we begin, for most people, let's begin with Austen. So there are huge changes that happen in fashion over this period. Throughout, for 200 years previously, women's bodies had been kind of shaped around the torso into an inverted V through stiffened bodices and stays, which is not necessarily restrictive, it's just shaping. And the waists was usually around the natural level. And suddenly in sort of about 1793, skirts started reducing, waistlines started going up, everything became much softer. Muslin started to dominate over silk as an elite fabric. The stays became shorter and shorter, and then much, much softer as well, until sort of a mere 7 years later, by 1800, instead of having this kind of inverted V large skirt paradigm, we had a column with a waistline under the bust, which is really quite a radical shift. And then into the sort of early 19th century, that developed and changed and started to become sort of the nascent romantic style. For men as well, they went through similar changes. A lot of silk drops out of their wardrobe. Breeches become replaced by trousers. The color palette goes much more somber, and the birth of kind of tailoring as we know it today to enhance and improve the body really takes off. So it's an electrically exciting period for clothing anyway. And so much of what is happening with dress, because dress is the closest things to our body and it's how we express ourselves on a daily level, are connected in much bigger sociocultural trends, with economics, with war, with trade, with expansion, with colonialism. And you can read all of that in dress, as well as looking at kind of the everyday, what did actually people get up and do with their bodies? We all get up and do something to our bodies every day. What did people back then do? So it's just such a rich world to look at from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a useful entry point for every aspect of life in the Regency period, it seems to me. And I love your summary of those changes. I recently went to the Fashion Museum in Bath, and you can really see the progression from that inverted V, like you're saying, to those flowing classical style gowns. And it really shows how deeply the neoclassical aesthetic was influential at that time. So the book has this fascinating organization method where instead of progressing chronologically, its 7 chapters expand in concentric circles from the most intimate to the most public domains. We start with self and then enlarge to home, then village, country, city, nation, and finally world. Why did you organize the book this way?
I think it's because my entry point into Regency dress was Jane Austen's body, essentially. I was looking at this pelisse, which is the only known body garment that belonged to her. And I was studying it really intensely partly to look at what we might be able to find out about her figure, and thinking a lot about the way she dressed and what her figure looked like. And I do have to say the structure kind of came to me just like that, because I was thinking about also the levels of social interaction that are in Austen's novels. There's the kind of the etiquette, but the very clear levels of what is appropriate when. So I was thinking about that, the interiority of what's inside the pelisse, but then that boundary of what's outside the pelisse. And also, I mean, I think chronology is a bit boring at this point. I think, we've had a lot of chronology, and I thought it didn't seem to me to be the most interesting ways to make connections. Mm-hmm. And then also, once I started thinking about moving outwards, one of the things I really wanted to challenge in the book was an idea that, I mean, there's a lot of scholarship on this now, that Jane Austen wasn't this kind of secluded, rural, spinsterish type. And I feel that that's still kind of part of the public image. And I spent a lot of this book wanting to subvert people's impressions of Jane Austen. And one of the best ways to do that, I thought, was to really show how her life and work can be connected with the absolute widest possible spheres of interaction in the world. And the more you look, the more connections there are that directly link her to the great events of the day, and to huge changes in the world that are going on. And so I just love this idea of, as I used the metaphor before, but kind of dropping Jane Austen as a stone into the pond of history, and then watching the ripples go outwards in this unfolding that also reflects the spheres of Regency interaction and social life. So yeah, and it just seemed to work like that. And once I decided it, that was it. I wrote the book like that. There was no shifting, there was no changing. It was clear from the get-go.
That's a wonderful metaphor. It's true that the myth of the domestic Austen is a myth that just won't die.
It will not die.
No. So you write that as Austen grows in writerly skill, her references to clothing become fewer, but also more meaningful. So when the author mentions an article of clothing or a piece of textile, we really have to pay attention because she's telling us something important about action or character. What are some examples of significant articles of clothing in Austen's works?
Well, investigating Colonel Brandon's flannel waistcoat in Sense and Sensibility, although that's, still an early work, it's a fantastic example of a highly resonant object. And I have set off on a whole fascinating journey into Georgian flannel underwear. I have a slight obsession with it now, and I'm going to write an article just on it, all based on Colonel Brandon's flannel waistcoat. So the scene is Marianne Dashwood, age 17, is introduced to Colonel Brandon, who has seen service in India, and he's age 35, which is, of course, ancient. And she says that, but he spoke of a flannel waistcoat, and for me that's always associated with rheumatism and ills. So she, in her position of youth, is saying, look, he wears flannel waistcoats, he's an old man, like flannels for sickness and illness. And this is reiterated in Regency texts throughout. So that's fine, and we could leave it there as kind of a symbol for Marianne of Colonel Brandon's age and impossibility. But military men wore flannels. So the flannel waistcoat is also a symbol of his position, but not only that, they were specifically recommended for people coming back from hot climates to chilly Britain. So it also places him, it's a reference to his Indian service. And then I also found one reference to a trope that says that old men shouldn't take young wives. They should just get a flannel waistcoat instead to keep them warm in bed at night. So in this one reference, we've got this multiplicity of irony, character, interrelationship, and action that it just passes. And we see it as a symbol of how Marianne sees him, but it's all of this other stuff going on that her readers would have been alert to. But because it's Austen, it just passes. And so it's things like that. There's so much depth in the way that she uses clothing. So another fantastic example of the way that Austen uses references to clothing or articles of dress to expand on character. There's an incident in Emma, so into the sort of the fuller, more mature work, where Mrs. Elton, the terribly vulgar, the terribly overdressed, with ideas above her position, Mrs. Elton, is mentioned as putting something into a purple and gold ridicule. Now, this for Austen is an uncharacteristically verbose description of a dress article. And so, again, it's worth paying attention to. Now, a reticule or ridicule was a type of sort of small handbag that had emerged as gowns got narrower. It's often said that they replaced pockets, the separate pockets that were worn in 18th century dress, but the two existed simultaneously. So it's a small handbag. Now, both names were equally used. Austen could have called this a reticule, but she doesn't. She calls this a ridicule, which is kind of a sly poke at Mrs. Elton. But not only that, this is a purple and gold ridicule. And in the letters, there's a few mentions of purple here and there. And Austen always seems to have she's never quite sure about purple as a color. She herself has a lilac dress, but not purple. So when you combine that with gold, it's like a rich, intense color that's slightly too much. And then you put gilding on it, something that's, a bit catches the light. It's a bit flashy. And purple and gold together is really quite a vulgar, overly fashionable, but not very tasteful ridicule. And in those 4 words, she manages to sum up Mrs. Elton's character, because she's a genius. So yeah, little things like that have much greater resonance when you unpack what they meant for Austen herself, and also how they're sitting in the possibilities of talking about clothing in the Regency period.
Wow, that is incredible. So much in these tiny items. So one of the articles of clothing that you mentioned in the Village chapter is the wedding pelisse that Annabella Milbank wore on the ill-fated day she became Lady Byron, speaking of pelisses, which were the entry point for this whole book. So could you explain what Lady Byron's bridal array tells us about Regency fashion and wedding dress traditions? And are there other articles of clothing related to the Keats-Shelley Byron circle that are of interest?
Well, I will say, in answer to the second part of that question first, that there is an excellent article about to come out in the journal Costume that looks at Byron's clothing in detail from wardrobe accounts. And that there hasn't been something written in this depth for a long, long time, or I think ever. And it's going to be connected with, I think they're going to do it with online resources, with tables of his stuff. So there's about to be a whole lot of Byron clothing ready for scholars to pick over, which is very exciting. It's one of those pieces of work that you're glad someone else has done, so you can just read it and then enjoy and take the bits you need. But the pelisse that Annabella Milbank wore, it's a really lovely and quite typical example of a Regency pelisse. She seems to have got married in a muslin dress, which would have been worn underneath the pelisse. And this is kind of, these two things together, a white muslin dress and a pelisse over the top, are really emblematic of Regency fashion, because the pelisse itself is a garment that couldn't exist while the skirt's puffed. It's very hard to have a coat that then falls over the skirts. So once things become columnar, coats for women become more popular. They are in pale colours, so white muslin, and this is sort of a creamy colour there as well. But at this point, there was no fixed tradition or even dominant tradition of white for weddings. It was often sort of Sunday best or a nice dinner gown. But because white was so fashionable and pale colours were so fashionable, these two things coincided. But that is coincidence more than design. But it is a kind of a lovely example of a middling to upper class quality silk pelisse. It's not particularly showy. It could be a lot more elaborate and have more decoration on it. It actually has quite a lot of parallels with Austen's own pelisse in terms of the slightly patterned fabric and the cording decoration. So it's very typical of its time. It's in fashion, but it's not too fashionable. And it's actually really quite a lovely garment. And I was pleased to be able to include it because it's, got such connection with one of the great figures of the Regency. And yeah, it's a beautiful piece of dress that actually represents Regency wedding clothing really quite well.
Yeah, and it's just for such a monumental moment in Romanticism. So I'm just going to show the illustration from your book of Annabella Milbank's pelisse, which is beautifully illustrated here. So moving from village to world, rather, the chapter entitled World, in your words, explores the fashion influence of Britain's global presence and dependence on textiles through clothing worn in its major colonies in India, the Caribbean, and the Antipodes. And you are, of course, joining us from the Antipodes today. What are some important ways that Regency fashion was influenced by global trade and colonization and vice versa? And how was fashion used as a tool of colonization?
Well, this chapter, in a sense, I think for me was the most important chapter because I really wanted to challenge a lot of ideas in it and point out the global nature of Regency dress. I am Australian and I'm used to working in earlier periods where the country, as I grew up in didn't exist. So Australia's found that in 1788 already has an Indigenous population, but that kind of the links of Britishness and how Britishness is expressed through textiles around the world and through interconnectivity, I thought was really important. As the concept of the East and the West Indies, as I think it's John Stuart Mill said, they're like just rooms of the house on the side. And I feel like not enough attention is given to the fact that Britain was the world. Like Britain had outposts everywhere. And also the fact that two of the key things about Regency dress, which is muslin and shawls, came from India. And they are essentially, quote unquote, exotic dress that has been domesticated and become this absolute paradigmatic norm of all sorts of respectabilities. But actually it was exotic. So the shawl was originally Kashmiri, worn by men. They're imported in some numbers throughout the sort of later 18th century, but they really kick off from the 1790s. And they're very expensive luxury items, and the desire for proper Kashmiri shawls then prompts the British shawl industry to make cheaper versions of it, and a whole industry ensues throughout the 19th century. It's the same with muslin. The fineness of Indian muslins, which Austen very famously has Henry Tilney talking about in Northanger Abbey, trying to compete for British manufacturers with the quality of Indian muslins was a large driver of some of the technological revolutions of the technological changes of the Industrial Revolution. And they do eventually get there, not least by completely undermining the industry in the muslin industry in India. So these kind of connections, I feel, are not really foregrounded enough. I'm also really starting to wonder, and I need to look into this more, if that high-waisted dress isn't also an Indian fashion influence. We are so used to kind of associating with the neoclassical movement. But if you actually have a look at what's happening in dress, the place that this iconic textile is coming from also has a tradition of high-waisted dresses made from that textile, both for men and women. And I found a reference from an old India hand, Captain Williamson, who says, oh no, look, the style of our present ladies' dresses is actually all based on Indian dress. And I'm really interested in following this up, because I think it can, again, shift our focus from this kind of European Greco-Roman neoclassicism to encompassing more of the wider world. So there's the kind of the connections between fashion and colonialism are complex and intertwined, especially, in the Caribbean, where the nature of the colonization there is, it's exploitative in the East Indies as well, but in the West Indies it's even more exploitative and has an enslaved population as well. So who is wearing what and what value the textiles have is really quite an important point. In Australia, or the colony of New South Wales as it was there, trying to, and this is very much the view at the time, but civilize the natives was done through clothing, because Australian Aboriginals traditionally don't wear very much clothing. They often have ceremonial garb, but they're not totally body covered through on a daily level. So for the British coming there, these naked savages, part of the civilizing action was to try and dress them and try and get them used to, proper clothes and turn them into real men. So it's very much part of that building of colony, but also I'm trying to work out how to describe the relationship between Indigenous Australians and the early colonists. It's, often fruitful, but more often traumatic and deadly. And clothing was part of that. So, yeah, I really wanted to put this in a book on Jane Austen, because it's not the kind of thing people expect. But you can make these direct links with the world that she lives in and the world that she knows. And yeah, that's why I love this chapter.
Yeah, me too. It's a really important, and as you say, really underexplored aspect of fashion history, and deserves much more attention as you give it. Regency adaptations in film and TV have been popular for a really long time, and there's a boom in the genre at the moment with series like Bridgerton and Sanditon garnering attention for their colorblind and color conscious casting. So are there any adaptations in particular that caught your attention in terms of fashion choices? And are there any Regency fashion myths that you would want to dispel?
Well, let's start with the myths first, because I have a list. And it goes like this. Regency women did not discard their corsets completely. This is one of the big myths. What they didn't do was wear stays, which are the heavily whaleboned stiff versions, but corsets were actually always simultaneously there as a softer, less boned bust support, because let's not forget, women always had breasts and you have to do something with them. And people too often concentrate on corsets being about waist reduction, which is mostly a Victorian notion anyway, and forget that, you've got to have support. And as we all know, the Regency is an incredibly busty period. So there's still a lot of stuff going on underneath there. So that's the first one. Regency women did wear corsets. Related to that is the idea that Regency women didn't wear petticoats. They got rid of them and were trying to affect nudity under these translucent gowns, which is like saying we all dress like Kim Kardashian, because that's something that fashion leaders, or the more outre or extreme or aristocratic, particularly more in France, would do. But even then, it's characterized in writing about it, people going, oh, she wasn't wearing any petticoats, and oh, it was crazy. It's extreme fashion. But in damp Hampshire, where Jane Austen's living, you're wearing your petticoats. You're wearing lots of them, and especially under muslin gowns. So again, it's something that maybe, if 1% of people do it, 99% of people are not doing it. I would also say one of the biggest myths about Regency dress is that women dampened their gowns to make them cling more closely. This, I have never found any evidence for women actually doing that. What we have is sources at the time saying their clothing looks as if they've dampened. And then actually it's 20th century early costume historians, as they were called then, who interpreted this to mean, oh, they did dampen. But I mean, one, it's really hard to do. What are you going to do? Carry a spray bottle around with you? And it makes it heavier. And muslin has a static surface. It clings anyway. So you don't need to do anything to it. What else? I think that's the big three that make me sort of hyperventilate slightly. But we'll leave it there, because I can get a little bit, ranty old lady about Regency women wore corsets. So we'll calm that down. But yes, we are going through rather a spate of interest in the Regency and the leading to the Regency core fashion style. When you say, adaptations that have caught my attention in terms of their fashion choices, do you mean both good and ill, or
oh yes, definitely both?
Okay. First of all, the adaptation of Emma by Autumn de Wilde that came out in 2020 is probably the best costumed Austen adaptation there's ever been, in terms of sheer accuracy and attention to detail. It's absolutely luminous and lovely and a gorgeous, gorgeous thing. I feel Bridgerton is much less successful. And there's been a lot of discussion about this because, of course, Bridgerton is a fantasy of the Regency period, what I'm calling Hayashire. It's very much coming out of the historical romance novel tradition rather than the Austen tradition. So there's been a lot of discussion about, oh, this isn't like a Jane Austen adaptation. Well, no, it's about aristocrats in the city. Jane Austen talks about gentry people in the country. Totally different thing. And so we have a fantasy notion of what the Regency does, and that's being expressed in costume, but they don't get the basic beats right. And this really comes down to the breasts. I've spent a lot of my time recently talking about Regency breasts. And one of the important things about this new softer corsets that they do, and one of the big changes in Regency dress, is that the 18th century stays give you a kind of a monobosom. So it gives you a profile like that, squashes everything together. And Regency styles uplift and separate. Imagine two oranges. So it's also the basis of Regency dress. You need that kind of bust to hang everything off. And what Bridgerton did was start right down at the basics with corsets that flatten the breasts in the 18th century manner. And so none of the dresses fit and none of them look right around the bust, because it's not, you don't have this gorgeous curvy silhouette. You've got kind of flatten and then muffin top sort of falling over the top. So because the corsets and the silhouettes aren't right and the breasts aren't right, the fit of the dresses isn't right. I love what they've done with the color, with the inventiveness, with the pushing, a lot of the dimensions, although, you know, a lot of the things they have pushed were there in the Regency already. But for me, it falls down on the breasts, because it's so essential to Regency dress. Lift, not flatten. But overall, I mean, I thought Bridgerton was heaps of fun, and I'm looking forward to the next season. But I do hope that they let the girls fly free this time.
Yeah, I've seen you talk on social media about corsets. So I think that's important, as you say, to think about sort of the reality of the female body and what it needs, which often gets neglected. Any projects that you're working on at the moment that you're particularly excited about, or any that you're planning for the future?
Well, as it happens, I am writing a follow-up book, and it's called Jane Austen's Wardrobe. And I'm going to be looking only at what we know Jane Austen herself wore. So it will be more of a sort of popular history book than Dress in the Age of Jane Austen. It'll also be coming out with the Yale University Press, but it's really a deep dive into what we know was in Austen's wardrobe and what that again meant in the bigger picture. So I'm going to get into more details of textiles, of cut, of embellishment, of how she shopped, and it's been really interesting. It's such an enjoyable project to work on, and I've learned so many more new things just being able to kind of go into specific detail about that. So yeah, that's I'm continuing in the Regency for a little bit longer. And again, like the first book, I just suddenly realized that nobody had done this. Jane Austen's letters are a wonderful source of information, and they come up in, you know, all sorts of texts, and people have sort of looked at them but not ever really gone into depth. So that's my next book that I'm writing, because I want to read it.
That's so exciting. I really look to about that, and really look forward to seeing it in print. So thank you so much, Hilary, for talking to us. This has been fascinating. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.